The neighborhood had always prided itself on being perfectly organized. Every lawn was trimmed, every mailbox uniform, and every fence straight as a ruler. To an outsider, it looked like the very definition of suburban perfection. But behind the polished facades and neatly painted doors, tension simmered like a hidden fire. At the center of it all was the HOA, the Homeowners Association, the very authority that maintained this picture-perfect image, but whose members wielded power with an almost frightening precision. For years, residents had whispered about the HOA president, a woman named Cynthia. Rumors circulated about her strict fines, her obsession with rules enforcement, and the subtle ways she seemed to manipulate others to maintain control. But for most, these were just stories. The rules were clear, the fines were enforceable, and the neighborhood's outward harmony made it easy to ignore the quieter discontent simmering beneath the surface. That is, until the cameras began to speak. Hidden security cameras, installed secretly by one of the newer residents, Michael, started capturing footage that would change everything. Michael had always been tech-savvy, a quiet man who spent more time tinkering with gadgets than socializing. He had installed the cameras not out of paranoia, but curiosity, an attempt to document the neighborhood for a personal project on suburban life. Little did he know that the cameras would reveal more than mundane lawn inspections or children playing. They would reveal a web of manipulation, deception, and outright abuse of power that had been brewing for years. It began with subtle things. A delivery driver handing off a package only to have Cynthia approach moments later, clipboard in hand, inspecting the porch and taking notes as if the act of delivery itself was a violation. A landscaper pruning a hedge according to HOA regulations, yet receiving a stern warning from the board member overseeing yard aesthetics. Michael's cameras captured every detail, and each clip seemed to expose the growing obsession the HOA had with control rather than community, but it didn't stop there. The footage began to show far more sinister behavior. Late at night, when the streets were empty and the houses slept, Cynthia and a select few board members would enter driveways without permission. They would take photos of decorations, personal belongings, and even the way homeowners parked their cars. At first, Michael assumed it was overzealous rule enforcement. But then the evidence grew darker. One evening, a camera facing the community park caught a shocking scene. Cynthia and two other board members moving garbage cans from one house to another, making it appear that a neighbor had violated waste disposal rules. Another camera recorded a board member tampering with a mailbox, stuffing it with official notices that were clearly fabricated. The videos painted a picture of a neighborhood where the people entrusted with fairness were, in reality, orchestrating chaos for their own amusement and power. The footage also revealed patterns. Every week, the board seemed to select one resident as a target, scrutinizing every detail of their property and personal life. Every complaint that reached the community forum appeared carefully coordinated, often initiated by the HOA members themselves or their allies. The hidden cameras showed them sneaking around backyards, peeking through blinds, and logging the minutiae of residents' lives, all under the guise of community improvement. The tension in the neighborhood began to rise even without the footage being public. Subtle threats, fines, and notes slid under doors became more aggressive. Yet, the residents had no tangible proof, only feelings, suspicions, and frustration. People whispered to neighbors, but the HOA maintained the image of a law-abiding, benevolent authority. That is, until Michael decided to compile the footage into a comprehensive record. He began organizing the clips, noting times, dates, and repeated violations of personal boundaries. Every suspicious activity, every act of manipulation, was logged. By the time he completed the first month of recordings, it was clear that the HOA wasn't just strict, it was corrupt. It wasn't enforcing rules for fairness, it was enforcing rules for control. And the cameras, silent and impartial, had captured the truth that no one else dared to see. Yet, Michael hesitated. Releasing the footage was dangerous. The HOA had power, influence, and knowledge of every home in the neighborhood. Exposing them could result in retaliation, lawsuits, or even intimidation. But keeping it hidden felt wrong. The residents were trapped, unknowingly living in a surveillance-driven, manipulated environment. The moral weight pressed on him, each frame of video a reminder that the neighborhood's perfect image was built on deception and fear. Michael's decision to act came after a particular night. The cameras recorded Cynthia herself walking into a resident's backyard, clearly tampering with property, when the resident wasn't home. She planted evidence to justify a fine, smiled as if satisfied with the deception, and left without a care. Watching the footage again and again, Michael realized that documenting was no longer enough. The residents had to know the truth. They had to take action, but carefully, or the HOA would crush any attempts at rebellion. As dawn broke over the neatly lined houses, Michael made his choice. He began preparing a plan to share the evidence selectively, to expose the HOA's corruption without putting the neighborhood in immediate danger. The stakes were high, but the potential reward, freedom from fear and manipulation, was worth it. The cameras had spoken. Now it was time for the residents to listen. The morning after Michael made his decision, the neighborhood was still cloaked in the calm of early light. Lawns glistened with dew, mailboxes stood straight, and the quiet streets betrayed no hint of the storm about to break. But inside homes, a quiet tension grew. Michael knew he couldn't simply upload all the footage online. The HOA had eyes everywhere, and a direct attack would be met with swift retaliation. He needed a strategy, a controlled release that would inform the residents without putting anyone at risk. He began with small, selective clips. The first was subtle, a board member placing a fake violation notice under a neighbor's door, captured clearly by one of the backyard cameras. He sent it anonymously to a small group of trusted neighbors, people he knew were skeptical of the HOA's perfection but had no proof of wrongdoing. Within hours, the video began to circulate quietly, shared from phone to phone, computer to computer. The initial shock was palpable. Faces paled, jaws tightened, and whispered conversations erupted in living rooms and kitchens. People began seeing the neighborhood in a new light, not as a model of harmony, but as a theater of manipulation and control. By the third day, more clips were added. One showed Cynthia herself orchestrating complaints about lawn heights, fences, and even garden gnomes, making sure certain residents were targeted repeatedly. Another showed board members sneaking into driveways in the dead of night, documenting the personal habits of families under the guise of community safety. Each clip was worse than the last, and the narrative became clear. The HOA was not maintaining order. They were playing a game of fear, using their authority to intimidate, manipulate, and dominate the community. The reactions were swift and intense. Residents who had been quiet for years suddenly found their voices. In private WhatsApp groups, discussions exploded. People shared their experiences, finds they never understood, letters they thought were official but now appeared fabricated, threats that were more intimidation than enforcement. The camera footage validated every suspicion, every uneasy feeling, every whispered complaint. For the first time, the neighborhood began to see a pattern, and the pieces fell together into a disturbing truth, but the HOA did not remain unaware. As more residents began noticing the leaked clips, Cynthia and her allies grew suspicious. They circulated their own messages about cybersecurity breaches and unauthorized recordings, attempting to frame the narrative as paranoia or invasion of privacy. Yet, the evidence was undeniable. The videos showed clear misconduct, intentional deceit, and repeated abuse of authority. For many residents, any fear of retaliation was outweighed by the need to reclaim control over their own lives. It wasn't long before the community began strategizing. Small meetings emerged, first in garages and living rooms, then in local parks and backyard patios. The residents discussed their shared grievances, each one confirming what the cameras had revealed. It was no longer about a single violation or petty argument over decorations. It was about the systemic abuse of power by those they had trusted. Michael remained cautious, aware that revealing himself too early could jeopardize the entire effort. But his recordings became the backbone of the movement, silent but undeniable proof of the HOA's corruption. As tensions rose, a few particularly brave neighbors decided to act first. They began documenting additional violations, not just by residents, but by the board itself. Using discreet cameras and smartphones, they caught board members in the act, falsifying reports, moving property to create evidence, and intimidating those who questioned authority. The cycle of exposure created momentum. Every new clip shared fueled the growing sense that the HOA's reign was fragile, built on fear rather than respect. The atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted dramatically. Previously obedient residents began speaking out at HOA meetings, questioning fines, and refusing to comply with arbitrary rules. The board's attempts to intimidate were met with defiance, as more people referenced the footage circulating online and in private groups. The dynamic of control was reversing. The residents, once cowed by authority, were now empowered with knowledge. However, with empowerment came risk. Cynthia, realizing the threat, attempted to consolidate her power. Letters were sent, legal threats were drafted, and security measures were increased. She tried to intimidate key residents, warning that anonymous recordings could have legal consequences. But these actions only intensified the resolve of the community. People had seen the truth, and the sense of collective outrage outweighed fear. By the end of the week, the first public challenge occurred. At the next HOA meeting, more residents attended than ever before. Cameras, phones, and laptops were quietly set up, documenting the proceedings. The atmosphere was tense, a silent battlefield of authority versus collective resistance. As board members attempted to assert their rules, the residents, emboldened by Michael's footage, countered with questions, accusations, and evidence. It became clear that the HOA's carefully maintained image was cracking. The climax of the chapter came when a particularly damning clip was played for a small group during a meeting, Cynthia herself manipulating evidence to fine a neighbor unjustly. The room fell silent. Whispers turned to murmurs, and murmurs turned into murmured outrage. The hidden cameras had done what words alone never could. They exposed the truth with irrefutable clarity. By the time the meeting ended, the residents had made a silent but unanimous decision. The HOA would no longer operate in shadows. They would reclaim their neighborhood, piece by piece, using truth as their weapon. And as the sun set over the neat rows of homes, the first sparks of rebellion had fully ignited, spreading through the streets like wildfire. But even with momentum on their side, the residents knew the fight was far from over. The HOA still held legal authority, resources, and influence. What had begun as exposure had now become strategy. The cameras had revealed the problem, but now the residents had to decide how far they were willing to go to restore their community and what risks they were prepared to take. The neighborhood had transformed in ways no one could have imagined. What began as quiet whispers and anonymous clips had grown into a full-blown movement. Residents were no longer passive participants in the HOA's orchestrated control. They were active, united, and armed with undeniable evidence. The cameras had revealed the truth, and now it was time for that truth to demand justice. The week leading up to the final confrontation was tense. Cynthia and her board members, once confident and untouchable, were on edge. Every movement they made, every note sent, every attempt to intimidate residents was now scrutinized. Hidden cameras, smartphones, and even strategically placed doorbell cams recorded their every action. The dynamic had completely flipped. The observers had become the observed. The aura of authority that had shielded the HOA for years was unraveling before their eyes. Meanwhile, the residents coordinated their strategy with precision. Meetings in garages, living rooms, and backyards became war rooms. Every clip from Michael's archives was cataloged, every instance of misconduct highlighted, and every legal violation noted. They mapped the timeline of abuses, creating a comprehensive dossier that documented not only individual infractions, but a pattern of systemic corruption. This wasn't personal vendetta, it was evidence-backed accountability. On the day of the showdown, the HOA office, a small, nondescript building at the edge of the community, became the center of attention. Residents gathered outside, cameras rolling, smartphones streaming live to private groups. Those who had previously hesitated now stood side by side, united by a shared sense of purpose. The atmosphere was electric, a mixture of tension, anticipation, and righteous determination. Inside, Cynthia attempted to maintain composure, but it was clear she knew the tide had turned. The board members whispered among themselves, reviewing legal documents and trying to anticipate what the residents might do. Their carefully constructed authority felt fragile, as if at any moment the entire house of cards could collapse. The confrontation began subtly. Residents entered the meeting room, presenting themselves with calm resolve. No shouting, no theatrics, just clear, organized evidence. Michael's footage was displayed, clips played one after another, exposing the HOA's manipulations, falsified fines, secret surveillance, property tampering, and intimidation tactics. Every act was documented, every deceit laid bare. The room fell silent with each revelation, the weight of years of unseen control pressing down on the board members. As the footage continued, murmurs spread throughout the room. Board members realized that their credibility was gone. Their carefully maintained image of fairness and authority crumbled under the scrutiny of both technology and collective memory. Legal advisors whispered anxiously, aware that these recordings could not be easily dismissed. Residents, empowered by the visual proof, began to assert themselves, pointing out every discrepancy, every manipulation, and every act of abuse. By mid-afternoon, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. Cynthia, once commanding, now appeared cornered, her confidence replaced by unease. The residents demanded accountability, removal of unjust fines, public acknowledgement of misconduct, and changes to the HOA's governance to prevent future abuse. It wasn't chaos, it was precision. Every demand was backed by evidence, every accusation impossible to refute. The turning point came when a compilation of the most egregious actions was displayed: the nighttime intrusions, the falsified complaints, and the blatant favoritism. The footage, presented in chronological order, told a story too compelling to ignore. It was a narrative of power abused, trust betrayed, and authority corrupted. Cynthia and her allies realized that their only option was to concede, to negotiate, and to acknowledge the extent of their wrongdoing. Outside, residents watched through live streams as the final decisions were being made. Cheers erupted quietly as word spread. Fines were being rescinded, board members were being voted out, and transparency measures were being implemented. The cameras that had begun as a tool of observation had become instruments of justice. The neighborhood had reclaimed its autonomy, not through aggression or confrontation, but through evidence, strategy, and unity. In the aftermath, the community began to heal. Residents installed community-controlled cameras, not as tools of surveillance, but as safeguards to ensure fairness. Meetings were conducted with transparency, complaints were handled openly, and new policies emphasized accountability rather than control. Michael, once an observer, became a quiet hero, having used technology to shine light on what had been hidden for years. Yet, the story left a lasting mark. The HOA, stripped of unchecked authority, served as a cautionary tale for neighboring communities. The residents learned a valuable lesson: appearances can be deceiving, and authority unchecked is vulnerable to abuse. But with unity, vigilance, and courage, even the most entrenched systems can be challenged and transformed. As the sun set over the now quiet streets, the neighborhood stood stronger than ever. Lawns remained neat, mailboxes straight, and fences uniform, but the perfection now had a different meaning. It was no longer imposed by fear, but chosen collectively, reinforced by transparency and trust. The cameras had spoken. The residents had listened, and the day the cameras blamed the HOA became the day the neighborhood reclaimed its freedom. In the end, the power of truth prevailed, not through confrontation alone, but through documentation, strategy, and a united community willing to face the shadows lurking behind suburban perfection. The HOA had been exposed, and the residents, once subdued, had finally taken back control of their lives.